About to be executed, a prisoner cried out to God. The miracle that happened next left everyone stunned. Rachel Martinez pressed her forehead against the cold steel bars of her death row cell, her dark eyes fixed on the setting Texas sun. 15 years had passed since that fateful night, yet the memory remained as sharp as broken glass. The year was 2009 when her world shattered, leaving behind a trail of addiction, tragedy, and an 8-year-old son who would grow up without his mother. The rhythmic sound of boots on concrete pulled her from her reverie. Officer Sarah Chen, one of the few guards who still treated her with humanity, appeared with tonight's dinner tray. "Evening, Rachel," she said softly, sliding the tray through the slot. "You've got another letter from Javier." Rachel's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Her son, now 23, had never stopped writing, never stopped believing in her innocence. She traced his familiar handwriting with her fingertips, remembering the little boy who used to draw her pictures with broken crayons. As she settled onto her narrow bunk, the memories of 2009 flooded back. She had been clean for 6 months then, the longest stretch since she'd first started using at 19. The methadone clinic had become her anchor, and her counselor, Maria, had helped her secure a job at a local diner. For the first time in years, she'd felt hope stirring in her chest. Javier had started smiling again, his trust in her slowly rebuilding with each sober day. Then came that rainy October night. Rachel had been walking home from her late shift, her waitress uniform still smelling of coffee and grease. The streets of East Houston were eerily quiet, save for the steady drumming of rain on concrete. She remembered checking her watch. 11:45. In 15 minutes, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door would finish her shift of watching Javier. The sound of shouting had drawn her attention to an alley ahead. 2 figures struggled in the darkness, one in a police uniform, the other in dark clothing. Rachel had frozen, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her 6 months of sobriety had given her a newfound sense of civic duty. She'd reached for her phone, ready to call 911. The gunshot had echoed like thunder. Rachel had watched in horror as Officer Michael Davidson, a 12-year veteran of the Houston Police Department, crumpled to the ground. The shooter fled past her, close enough that she caught a glimpse of his face, young, Hispanic, with a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Their eyes had met for a fraction of a second before he vanished into the night. She'd rushed to the officer, her hands pressing against his chest as blood seeped through his uniform. "Help!" she'd screamed into the empty street. "Somebody help!" His eyes had locked onto hers, filled with pain and confusion, before the light in them slowly faded. By the time backup arrived, Officer Davidson was dead and Rachel's hands and clothes were covered in his blood. Her past record of drug offenses and the residual methadone in her system had made her an easy target for the prosecution. The shooter's description she provided matched dozens of young men in East Houston, and without any other witnesses, her story of trying to help had fallen on deaf ears. The trial had been a blur of orange jumpsuits and harsh fluorescent lights. Her court-appointed lawyer, fresh out of law school, had been overwhelmed by the high-profile nature of the case. The prosecution had painted her as a desperate addict who killed a police officer, possibly during a failed robbery attempt. They'd emphasized her history of drug abuse, her prior arrests for possession, the times she'd lost custody of Javier to her mother. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor had declared in his closing statement, "Rachel Martinez wants you to believe she's a reformed woman who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the evidence tells a different story. A dedicated police officer is dead. His blood is literally on her hands. And the only story we have about another shooter comes from a woman who's lied countless times before to feed her addiction." The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty. When the judge had pronounced her death sentence, Rachel's only thought had been of Javier, sitting in the courtroom with her mother, his small face crumpled in confusion and fear. Now 15 years later, Rachel unfolded her son's latest letter. His words were filled with the same unwavering faith that had sustained her through countless appeals and setbacks. "Dear Mum, I had another dream about you coming home. In it, you were standing in sunlight and your smile was just like I remember from the good days. I know in my heart you're innocent. No matter what anyone says, I know my mother would never take a life. Keep praying, Mum, God knows the truth. Love always, Javier." A tear splashed onto the paper, smudging the ink. Rachel carefully folded the letter and placed it in her Bible, alongside dozens of others. She'd found faith in prison, not in a dramatic conversion, but through the patient ministry of Father Miguel, the prison chaplain who'd looked past her conviction to see the truth in her heart. The sun had fully set now, leaving her cell in shadows. In less than 24 hours she would be dead, another name in the long list of Texas executions. All her appeals had been exhausted, her petitions for clemency denied. Even the Innocence Project, which had taken her case 5 years ago, had run into dead ends. Rachel moved to her small desk, picked up her pen and began what she thought would be her final letter to Javier. My dearest son, as I write this, I think of all the moments we've missed. Your high school graduation, your first heartbreak, your college years. But I want you to know that every day of sobriety, every moment of clarity I've had in here has been because of you. You were the light that guided me out of darkness, and even though that light was cut short, it changed me forever. I didn't kill Officer Davidson. I tried to save him. I've carried the weight of his death every day, along with the pain of leaving you. But I want you to know that the woman you believed in, the mother who made you pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and sang you to sleep with old Mexican lullabies, she was real. Those 6 months of sobriety showed me who I could be, who I should have been for you all along. Tomorrow they'll say justice is being served, but you know the truth. Keep it alive, mijo. Let it guide you to be better than I was, to help others who've lost their way, and know that every breath I've taken in this place has been filled with love for you, your mother. Always, Rachel. She placed the letter in an envelope just as Officer Chen returned for her nightly rounds. The guard's eyes were sympathetic as she peered through the bars. You should try to get some sleep, Rachel. Rachel nodded, though she knew sleep would be impossible. As she lay on her bunk, she thought of Officer Davidson's family, his wife and 2 daughters who'd sat stoically through her trial, their grief and anger palpable. She thought of the real killer, wondering if he ever thought about that night, if guilt ever kept him awake in the dark hours. Most of all, she thought of Javier and how her addiction had set them both on this tragic path. If she hadn't started using, she would have been home that night, not walking the dangerous streets after a late shift at a job that barely paid the bills. Her sobriety had come too late to change her past, but it had given her the clarity to face her future, even if that future ended tomorrow at 6 p.m. As midnight approached, Rachel knelt beside her bunk to pray. She had spent 15 years maintaining her innocence, but now, facing death, she prayed not for herself but for peace, for Javier, for Officer Davidson's family, and for all those trapped in the cycles of addiction and poverty that had shaped her life. She couldn't know that in less than 24 hours, her world would be transformed by a miracle that would shake the foundations of justice in Texas. For now, she was simply Rachel Martinez, prisoner number 19876, waiting in the dark for her final dawn. The walls of death row had witnessed 15 years of Rachel Martinez's unwavering fight for justice. Each day in the Mountain View unit, Texas's death row facility for women, had been marked by a delicate balance between hope and despair. Through the narrow window of her cell, she had watched 5,475 sunrises, each one a reminder of her survival and her struggle to prove her innocence. Her first year had been the hardest. The transition from being a recovering addict and mother to a death row inmate had nearly broken her. The nights were filled with the echoes of other women's sobs, the days with the mechanical routine of prison life. She remembered her first appeal hearing, 6 months after her conviction, when her court-appointed lawyer had fumbled through the proceedings, missing crucial deadlines and failing to present key evidence. "Your Honor," he had stammered, his tie askew and papers scattered across the defense table. "We believe there are substantial grounds for appeal based on, inadequate representation during the initial trial." The irony of his own inadequacy had not been lost on the court, and the appeal had been swiftly denied. It was during her second year that Father Miguel Ramirez had entered her life. The prison chaplain had first noticed her during a Sunday service, sitting alone in the back, her eyes fixed on the cross with an intensity that spoke of both desperation and hope. After the service, he had approached her cell. "I see you at every service," he had said, his voice gentle but firm, "but you never take communion." Rachel had looked up from her Bible, her fingers tracing the worn pages. "I didn't think I deserved it," she had replied softly. "After everything I've done, tell me about everything you've done," Father Miguel had encouraged, pulling up a chair outside her cell. For the first time since her conviction, Rachel had found someone willing to listen without judgment. She had told him about her addiction, about her struggles as a single mother, about that fateful night with Officer Davidson. The priest had listened intently, his dark eyes reflecting not condemnation, but understanding. From that day forward, Father Miguel had become her strongest advocate. He had helped her connect with the Innocence Project in her 5th year of imprisonment, and together they had begun the painstaking process of rebuilding her case. The priest had spent countless hours researching similar cases, reaching out to witnesses, and praying with Rachel when all other avenues seemed closed. Through the years, her legal battles had become increasingly complex. The Innocence Project's lawyers had discovered disturbing inconsistencies in the original investigation. The murder weapon had never been found, and the gunshot residue test results from Rachel's hands had been inconclusive. Yet each new appeal had been met with bureaucratic resistance and procedural roadblocks. The system is designed to maintain convictions, not overturn them, Sarah Chen, her Innocence Project lawyer, had explained during their 10th year of appeals. But we're not giving up. There's something about your case, Rachel. The pieces don't fit. Rachel's transformation within the prison walls had been remarkable. She had earned her GED in her 3rd year, followed by college credits through a prisoner education program. Her cell had become a makeshift library filled with legal textbooks and religious studies materials. Other inmates had started coming to her for advice, both legal and spiritual. The letters from Javier had been her lifeline throughout these years. She had watched him grow up through carefully penned words and occasional photographs. His first day of high school, his graduation, his acceptance to college, each milestone marked with ink on paper, each achievement celebrated within the confines of her cell. She had kept every letter, arranging them chronologically in a shoebox under her bunk, a paper trail of her son's journey to adulthood. "Mom," he had written in his graduation letter, "I'm becoming a lawyer. I'm going to learn everything about the system that took you away from me, and I'm going to fight to change it. Professor Martinez at the law clinic says I have a natural talent for criminal defense. Maybe it's because I learned from the best. Watching you fight all these years has taught me more about justice than any textbook could." The news of Javier's career choice had filled Rachel with both pride and sadness. She had never wanted her situation to define his life, yet here he was, transforming their tragedy into purpose. She had written back immediately, "My dearest Javier, your decision to become a lawyer fills my heart with so many emotions, I can barely contain them. I am proud of the man you've become, but remember that your life is your own. Don't let my story consume you. Find justice in your own way, on your own terms. Love always, Mom." As the years had passed, Rachel had developed a reputation among both inmates and guards as a source of wisdom and calm. She had started a prayer group that met 3 times a week, sharing stories of hope and redemption with other women facing life sentences or death row. Even the most hardened guards had begun to question her guilt, though they never said so openly. Officer Sarah Chen had been particularly moved by Rachel's quiet dignity. Over the years, their relationship had evolved from the formal distance of guard and prisoner to something approaching friendship. Sarah had been there during Rachel's darkest moments, like the day her mother had passed away, without reconciling with her, and during small victories, like when Rachel had earned her associate's degree. "You know," Sarah had confided during a quiet night shift in Rachel's 12th year, "I've worked death row for 15 years. Most women in here, you can see the guilt eating at them even when they deny it. But you're different. There's a peace about you, even after all this time." Rachel had smiled sadly. "Peace came when I forgave myself. Not for Officer Davidson's death, because I didn't kill him, but for all the ways I failed my son before that night. Addiction, poor choices, lost time. That's the guilt I had to face." The greatest test of Rachel's faith had come in her 13th year, when a promising lead had emerged. A former gang member had come forward, claiming to know the identity of the real killer. For 3 months, hope had surged through the prison as lawyers had worked to verify his story. But like so many leads before it, this one had crumbled under investigation. The witness had recanted, claiming he had made up the story in hopes of reducing his own sentence. That night, Rachel had fallen to her knees in her cell, her prayers more desperate than ever. "God," she had whispered into the darkness, "I don't understand your plan, but I trust you. If I am to die here, let my death mean something. Let it bring change." Father Miguel had found her the next morning, still on her knees, her Bible open to the book of Job. He had knelt beside her cell, reaching through the bars to grasp her hand. "Your faith humbles me," he had said softly. Even Job cried out against God in his suffering. Now in her 15th year, with all appeals exhausted and her execution date set, Rachel faced her greatest challenge, the The legal system had failed her at every turn, yet her faith remained unshaken. She had touched countless lives within these walls, her story becoming a testament to the power of grace under the most desperate circumstances. As she prepared for what she believed would be her final week, Rachel couldn't know that God was about to answer her prayers in a way that would transcend all human understanding. Her 15 years of struggle had been a preparation for something greater than she could imagine, a divine intervention that would shake the foundations of justice in Texas and transform countless lives. But for now, she continued her daily routine, prayer, study, and ministry to others, maintaining her dignity and faith even as the hour of her execution approached. Her story, she believed, was in God's hands, and whether it ended in death or deliverance, she was at peace with His will. The clock on the Mountain View unit's wall read 11:15 p.m. when Rachel Martinez began what she believed would be her final night on earth. The familiar sounds of death row at night, the distant clanking of metal doors, the muffled sobs of fellow inmates, the steady footsteps of guards seemed somehow sharper, more significant on this particular evening. In less than 24 hours, she was scheduled to receive the lethal injection that would end her 15-year fight for justice. Officer Sarah Chen approached Rachel's cell for the final night check, her footsteps heavier than usual. "You have visitors coming at midnight," she said softly, her voice catching slightly. "Father Miguel and your son." Rachel's heart leaped into her throat. She hadn't expected Javier to come so late, though she knew he'd been granted special permission for a final visit. She smoothed her grey prison uniform and ran her fingers through her greying hair, a mother's instinct to look presentable for her child still strong after all these years. The cell, which had been her home for 15 years, seemed smaller tonight. The walls were covered with photos of Javier, his high school graduation, his college acceptance letter, his first day of law school. Each image told the story of a life she had watched unfold through reinforced glass and supervised visits. Her Bible lay open on the small metal desk, its pages worn from countless hours of study and prayer. At 11:45, Father Miguel arrived first. The aging priest's face bore the weight of many sleepless nights spent advocating for Rachel's case. "My daughter," he said, reaching through the bars to take her hand, "are you ready for this night?" Rachel squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the familiar warmth. "I've been ready for 15 years, Father, but something feels different tonight. It's as if..." She paused, searching for the right words. "It's as if the air itself is waiting for something." The priest's eyes narrowed slightly at her words. In 15 years of ministry to death row inmates, he had never heard Rachel speak this way. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Javier appeared, now a tall, distinguished-looking young man of 23, wearing a suit and carrying his law books. "Mom," he breathed, pressing as close to the bars as the guards would allow. Rachel reached out to touch his face, remembering the 8-year-old boy who had sat in the courtroom, unable to understand why his mother was being taken away. "My son," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My beautiful, look at you, a lawyer now. Everything I couldn't be." Javier shook his head fiercely. "Don't talk like that. I've been reviewing your case files. Again, there are inconsistencies we never addressed. The gunshot residue tests, the missing weapon, the timeline discrepancies. If we could just get the governor to..." "Javier," Rachel interrupted gently, "we've tried everything. You've tried everything. It's time to accept that some battles can't be won in a courtroom." "Then where?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Where do we fight when the system fails? When the truth isn't enough?" Father Miguel stepped forward, placing a hand on Javier's shoulder. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we must look beyond human justice to divine intervention." Rachel felt a strange, tingling sensation run through her body at the priest's words. The fluorescent lights in the corridor seemed to flicker, though no one else appeared to notice. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of something. Not fear, not resignation, but a profound sense of anticipation. "Mom?" Javier's worried voice brought her back to the present. "Are you okay?" Rachel opened her eyes, offering him a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, mijo. Just tired. Tell me about law school. Tell me about your life." For the next hour, they talked through the bars. Javier shared stories about his classes, his plans to work with the Innocence Project, his dreams of systemic reform. Rachel listened intently, memorizing every detail of his face, every inflection in his voice. This was what she wanted to take with her to whatever lay ahead. Not the bitterness of injustice, but the pride of seeing her son transform their tragedy into purpose. At one point, Officer Chen brought them coffee, bending the rules one last time for the woman she had come to respect over the years. The hot liquid warmed Rachel's hands as she held the cup, savoring this simple comfort. "I have something for you," Javier said, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a small, worn book, The Velveteen Rabbit. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. It was the book she used to read to him every night, in the good days before addiction had taken her away from him the first time. "You kept it," she whispered. "Of course I did. I used to read it every night after they took you away. It helped me remember your voice." Javier opened the book, his fingers tracing the yellowed pages. "Would you read it to me, one last time?" Rachel took the book with trembling hands. As she began to read, her voice grew stronger, carrying the familiar words down the quiet corridor. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day. "Real isn't how you are made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you." Other inmates fell silent, listening to the story of love and transformation echo through death row. Even the guards paused in their rounds, touched by the sight of a mother reading to her grown son through prison bars. As Rachel reached the end of the story, she felt that strange sensation again, a heightening of her senses, as if reality itself was becoming sharper, more intense. The air seemed to thicken with an invisible presence. Father Miguel, who had been quietly praying his rosary, looked up suddenly, his eyes wide. "Rachel," he said urgently, "do you feel that?" Before she could answer, the lights flickered again, more noticeably this time. A profound stillness settled over the cell block, broken only by the sound of Rachel's heartbeat thundering in her ears. She gripped the bars of her cell, overwhelmed by a certainty that something momentous was about to happen. "Mom?" Javier's voice seemed to come from far away. "What's happening?" Rachel turned to her son, and for a moment she saw him not as the accomplished young man he had become, but as the innocent child who had never stopped believing in her. "Mijo," she said, her voice steady despite the strange energy coursing through her. "Remember what the skin horse said about becoming real. Sometimes it happens slowly, through years of love and faith. And sometimes—" Her voice trailed off as the sensation intensified. The air around her seemed to shimmer, though she couldn't tell if anyone else could see it. Father Miguel had risen to his feet, his rosary clutched tightly in his hands. Officer Chen stood frozen at her post, staring at Rachel's cell with an expression of wonder and confusion. As the clock struck 2, marking the beginning of Rachel's final day, she felt a presence enter her cell, not threatening but overwhelming in its power and purpose. Her last conscious thought was of Javier's face, watching her with a mixture of fear and hope, as the ordinary world began to fade away and something extraordinary took its place. The transformation that had begun 15 years ago in a prison chapel was about to reach its culmination, though none of them could have predicted the form it would take. Rachel Martinez, death row inmate number 109876, was about to become the vessel for a miracle that would shake the foundations of justice in Texas and transform countless lives. But for now, in this suspended moment between night and dawn, mother and son clung to each other through cold steel bars, while Father Miguel prayed fervently, and Officer Chen stood witness to the beginning of something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, justice, and the power of divine intervention. 2:30 in the morning, and the atmosphere in Rachel's cell had transformed into something otherworldly. The air itself seemed to pulse with an electric energy that made the fluorescent lights flicker and buzz. Officer Sarah Chen, who had been about to end her shift, found herself rooted to her post, unable to leave as she watched the extraordinary scene unfold before her. Rachel stood in the center of her cell, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. The strange shimmer that had begun during Javier's visit had intensified, creating what appeared to be a soft halo of light around her slender frame. Father Miguel clutched his rosary tightly, his prayers now whispered in rapid Spanish, while Javier pressed himself against the bars, his law books forgotten on the floor. "Mom?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" But Rachel was beyond hearing. She had entered a realm between worlds, where past and present merged into a single, crystalline moment of clarity. The vision struck her with the force of a physical blow, dropping her to her knees on the cold concrete floor. She saw the night of Officer Davidson's murder with a clarity that transcended memory. But this time, she wasn't watching from her own perspective. Instead, she found herself inhabiting the consciousness of the true killer, experiencing his thoughts, his emotions, his devastating choices. "His name is Marcus Rodriguez," she gasped, the words forcing themselves from her throat in a voice that didn't sound entirely like her own. 22 years old when it happened, member of the East Side Lobos gang. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from a knife fight 3 years before. Father Miguel quickly pulled out a small notebook, his hands shaking as he recorded every detail. Officer Chen had moved closer to the cell, her professional detachment forgotten in the face of what was unfolding. He was running drugs for the gang, Rachel continued, her eyes still fixed on something distant. Officer Davidson had been getting too close to their operation. They drew straws to see who would take him out. Marcus lost. The vision shifted, and Rachel let out a small cry of pain. He didn't want to do it. He had a little sister the same age as Javier, but they threatened to hurt her if he didn't follow through. He waited in that alley for 3 hours before Officer Davidson walked past. Javier had pulled out his phone and was recording everything, his legal training kicking in, even in the midst of this supernatural event. "Mum, can you see what happened next?" Rachel's body trembled as the scene continued to unfold in her mind. The gun, it was a Glock 17, serial number filed off. He buried it in Memorial Park, 20 paces north of the old oak tree near the jogging trail. Her voice broke as tears began streaming down her face. Officer Davidson tried to talk to him. He could see how young Marcus was, tried to tell him there was another way. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, and a cold wind seemed to sweep through the cell block, though there were no windows nearby. Rachel's next words came out in a rush, as if she couldn't contain them. The shot wasn't meant to kill. Marcus panicked, aimed too high. The bullet hit an artery. There was so much blood. She swayed, and for a moment it seemed she might collapse, but an invisible force appeared to hold her upright. He ran past me. Our eyes met. He saw me try to help Officer Davidson. For 15 years he's carried that image. Me, kneeling there, trying to stop the bleeding while he ran away. Father Miguel stepped closer to the bars. "Rachel, where is Marcus now? Can you see him?" Rachel's head turned sharply to the east, as if responding to a distant call. "He's been in Houston all this time, living under a false name, Thomas Ramirez, working as a janitor at St. Michael's Church on Wayside Drive. The guilt, it's eating him alive." Officer Chen had pulled out her own phone and was quietly speaking into it, presumably to someone in authority. Javier continued recording, his legal mind already formulating how they might use this information, even as his heart raced at the supernatural transformation of his mother. "Every Sunday," Rachel continued, her voice growing stronger, "he lights a candle for Officer Davidson. He wants to confess, but he's afraid. The gang, they're still watching. His sister has children now. He's afraid for them." Suddenly, Rachel's body went rigid again, and her eyes widened with a new urgency. "He's there now, at the church. The burden is too heavy. He's going to—" She gasped, as if struggling for air. "He's going to confess. Tonight. He can't bear to let another person die for his crime." The lights in the cell block stabilized, and Rachel slowly sank to her knees, exhausted. Father Miguel immediately began making calls, his voice urgent as he contacted colleagues at St. Michael's Church. Officer Chen was speaking rapidly into her radio, calling for immediate action at the location Rachel had specified. Javier reached through the bars to grasp his mother's hand. "Mom, can you hear me now? Are you okay?" Rachel's eyes gradually focused on her son's face, the otherworldly gleam fading but not entirely disappearing. "I'm here, mijo," she whispered. "I saw everything. God showed me everything." Father Miguel ended his call and turned to them with excitement. "The priest at St. Michael's confirms there's a janitor matching that description. He just arrived at the church, asking to make an urgent confession." Officer Chen stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "I've contacted the warden and the district attorney's office. They're sending people to the church now, and I've called for a team to search Memorial Park at first light." Rachel leaned against the bars of her cell, suddenly feeling every one of her 45 years. "It's not over," she said softly, that strange resonance still present in her voice. "This is just the beginning. God isn't finished yet." As if to confirm her words, the lights flickered once more, and that supernatural electricity crackled through the air again. Father Miguel crossed himself, whispering a prayer of protection. Even the ever-practical Officer Chen took a step back, sensing that they were in the presence of something that defied rational explanation. "Rachel," Father Miguel said gently, "how long have you been having these experiences?" She shook her head slowly. "Never before tonight. But I've felt something building for weeks, like pressure before a storm. I think—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think God waited until all human efforts were exhausted, until there was no way forward except through divine intervention. Javier, who had been reviewing the video he'd recorded, looked up with tears in his eyes. "The details, Mom. They're so specific. Things you couldn't possibly know. This has to be enough to at least delay the execution." Rachel reached through the bars to wipe away her son's tears, just as she had done when he was small. "Have faith, mijo. What's happening here is bigger than just my case. God is about to shake the foundations of everything we think we know about justice and mercy." As the first hints of dawn began to color the eastern sky, Rachel felt another wave of that divine energy building within her. The vision had left her both exhausted and exhilarated, filled with a certainty that transcended human understanding. In less than 15 hours, she was scheduled to die by lethal injection. But as she looked at the faces of those gathered around her cell, her son, the faithful priest, the converted guard, she knew with unshakable certainty that God had other plans. The miracle had begun, but it was far from over. Rachel Martinez, once a broken addict and now a vessel of divine revelation, closed her eyes and prepared herself for whatever would come next. The truth was finally emerging, not through legal arguments or human effort, but through the mysterious workings of a power that could make even prison walls tremble. The clock on the prison wall read 11 in the morning as Rachel Martinez was escorted to the small room where death row inmates received their final meal. Sunlight streamed through the barred windows, creating patterns on the metal table where a tray of food waited. After the supernatural events of the early morning hours, the ordinary act of eating seemed almost surreal. Officer Sarah Chen, who had stayed well past her shift, walked beside Rachel. Neither woman mentioned how the guard's hand trembled slightly as she unlocked the handcuffs. The events they had witnessed mere hours ago had shattered their understanding of reality, leaving them in a strange liminal space between the mundane and the miraculous. "The warden approved Father Miguel and your son to join you," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of hope. "They're waiting inside," Rachel nodded, still feeling the lingering effects of her vision. The air around her continued to shimmer faintly, visible only to those who knew to look for it. As she entered the room, she saw Javier and Father Miguel seated at the table, both looking exhausted but alert. They had spent the early morning hours coordinating with authorities about her revelations regarding Marcus Rodriguez. "Mom," Javier stood, his lawyer's notepad covered in hurried scribbles. "They found the gun. Exactly where you said it would be, under the oak tree in Memorial Park. The serial number matches a shipment stolen from a police evidence locker 15 years ago." Father Miguel crossed himself, murmuring a prayer of thanks. "The police are at St. Michael's Church now. Marcus is still there, speaking with Father Anthony." Rachel sat down at the table, looking at the food before her. Chicken enchiladas, rice and beans, the same meal she used to cook for Javier on Sunday afternoons. The normality of it struck her as almost funny, given the circumstances. But as she reached for her fork, that now familiar sensation began to build again. The fluorescent lights flickered, and the air grew thick with supernatural presence. Father Miguel leaned forward, recognizing the signs. "Rachel, is it happening again?" Before she could answer, words began pouring from her mouth in a language none of them recognized. The sound was ancient, melodic, filling the small room with what felt like living energy. Officer Chen, who had been standing by the door, quickly pulled out her phone and began recording. "It's Aramaic," Father Miguel whispered, his eyes wide. "The language of Jesus." Rachel's body swayed slightly as she continued to speak, her voice carrying tones and cadences that seemed impossible for human vocal cords to produce. Javier, despite his scientific legal training, found himself moved to tears by the otherworldly beauty of the sound. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the foreign language ceased. Rachel's eyes snapped open, now filled with an intense clarity. "Marcus is confessing everything," she said, her voice carrying that same resonant quality from the night before. "Right now, at this very moment, I can see him kneeling before Father Anthony, describing every detail of that night." She turned to face the eastern wall, as if seeing through it to the church miles away. "He's telling them about the gang's threats against his sister, about the stolen gun, about seeing me try to save Officer Davidson. He's crying, the weight of 15 years of guilt finally breaking." Officer Chen spoke quietly into her radio, confirming Rachel's words with officers at the scene. Within moments, she received a response that made her face pale. "Everything you just said, it's happening exactly as you described. They're recording his confession now." Rachel barely seemed to hear her. Her attention had shifted again, her gaze now distant. "There's more," she said, her voice growing stronger. "God is showing me more. I can see..." "I can see Governor Richards in his office." Javier quickly turned to a fresh page in his notepad. "What's he doing, Mum?" "He's reviewing my case file. There's a strange light in his office. He can feel it too, though he doesn't understand what it is. He's been a supporter of the death penalty his entire career, but right now," Rachel's voice caught with emotion, "right now, God is touching his heart. He's remembering his own daughter's struggle with addiction, how close she came to destruction before finding recovery." Father Miguel and Officer Chen exchanged glances. The governor's daughter's battle with addiction wasn't public knowledge, but both knew it to be true through their professional channels. "The evidence is all coming together," Rachel continued, her words tumbling out with increasing urgency. "The gun, Marcus's confession, old security footage from the evidence locker showing who stole the weapons, DNA under Officer Davidson's fingernails that was never tested." She gasped suddenly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, God is not finished. There's so much more to come." The room had grown preternaturally still, every person present aware that they were witnessing something beyond human understanding. The sunlight through the windows seemed to bend around Rachel, creating that same subtle halo effect they had observed during the night. Javier reached across the table to grasp his mother's hand. "Mom, look at me. Are you okay?" Rachel turned to her son, and for a moment her eyes seemed to contain galaxies. "I'm more than okay, mijo. For the first time in 15 years, I'm exactly where I need to be. God didn't just send these visions to save me. This is about something much bigger, about justice, about redemption, about the power of divine truth to break through human barriers." As if to emphasize her words, she began speaking in tongues again, but this time in multiple languages, flowing seamlessly from one to another. Father Miguel, who had studied linguistics in seminary, recognized fragments of ancient Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, mixed with languages he had never heard before. Officer Chen's radio crackled with updates. Marcus Rodriguez's confession was being transcribed. The gun had been retrieved and was already at the forensics lab. The governor had called an emergency meeting with his legal team. Events were unfolding at a pace that seemed impossible in the usually glacial world of death row appeals. The food on Rachel's tray remained untouched, steam rising from the enchiladas into the supernaturally charged air. This was meant to be her last meal, but increasingly it seemed that God had other plans. The divine presence in the room had become almost palpable, pressing against their skin like static electricity. "Rachel," Father Miguel said gently, "perhaps we should pray, together, to thank God for these miracles and ask for guidance for what's to come." She nodded, but as they bowed their heads, she suddenly stiffened again. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying that otherworldly resonance. "Someone else is praying too. I can see Officer Davidson's widow." The room grew very quiet. Catherine Davidson had been a prominent voice calling for Rachel's execution, her grief and anger unchanged by 15 years. The thought of her praying now sent ripples of anticipation through the small group. "She's in her garden," Rachel continued, her eyes closed but tears streaming down her face. "She's just received a call about Marcus's confession. She's on her knees among her roses, asking God if she's been wrong all these years. The same light I saw in the governor's office. It's surrounding her too." Javier was writing frantically, documenting every detail. Officer Chen had stepped into the hallway to make a call, her voice urgent as she relayed information to her superiors. Father Miguel's lips moved in silent prayer, his rosary beads clicking softly through his fingers. Rachel's voice grew stronger, filled with a compassion that seemed larger than herself. Catherine is remembering Michael's last words to her. "Look for the light, Kathy. Always look for the light." She never understood what he meant until this moment. God is showing her the truth, not just about that night, but about the power of forgiveness. The fluorescent lights flickered again, more intensely this time, and for a moment, the room was filled with a golden glow that seemed to emanate from Rachel herself. When it faded, she slumped slightly in her chair, exhausted but smiling. "It's all connected," she whispered. "Every prayer, every tear, every moment of faith in the darkness, God has been weaving them together for this day. This isn't just about proving my innocence, it's about healing wounds that have festered for 15 years. Officer Chen returned to the room, her face flushed with excitement. "Rachel, you won't believe this. Catherine Davidson is on her way here. She's demanding to see you and the governor. He's called a press conference for 3 o'clock. Rachel looked at the untouched food before her and smiled gently. "I don't think this will be my last meal after all. God isn't finished yet. Not by a long shot." The air in the room hummed with possibility as they waited for what would come next. The miracle that had begun in the early morning hours was building towards something none of them could fully comprehend, but all could feel. Rachel Martinez, once condemned to die, had become a vessel for divine intervention, and through her, God was about to transform not just one life but an entire system. Marcus Rodriguez knelt in the dimly lit confessional of St. Michael's Church, his body trembling with 15 years of suppressed guilt. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across his face, a face marked by a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. At 47 years old, he looked much older, the weight of his secret having carved deep lines into his features. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It has been 15 years since my last confession." His fingers traced the worn wooden panel separating him from Father Anthony, the same panel he had cleaned countless times during his years as the church's janitor. Father Anthony, who had known him only as Thomas Ramirez, leaned closer to the screen. He had received an urgent call from Father Miguel just hours before, preparing him for this moment. "Go on, my son," he encouraged gently. "God is listening." Marcus drew a shaky breath. "I killed a man," he said, the words tumbling out like stones. "A police officer, Michael Davidson, and for 15 years, I've let an innocent woman take the blame." Outside the confessional, 2 police detectives waited quietly, recording devices running with the church's permission. They had arrived shortly after Marcus, following the miraculous revelations from Rachel Martinez's cell. "It was October 12th, 2009, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as the long-buried truth fought its way to the surface. "I was 22, running with the East Side Lobos. Officer Davidson had been investigating our drug operations. The gang leaders decided he needed to be eliminated." He paused, wiping tears from his face. "They threatened my sister, Maria. She had 3 young children. Said they'd hurt them if I didn't do it. We drew straws. I lost." His voice cracked. "They gave me a stolen gun, a Glock 17. The serial number was filed off." Father Anthony remained silent, allowing Marcus to speak at his own pace. Through the confessional screen, he could see the man's shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I waited in that alley for 3 hours. When Officer Davidson walked by, I stepped out with the gun. But he saw something in my face. He tried to talk to me, told me I could choose a different path." Marcus's words came faster now, as if the memories were burning him. "I panicked. The gun went off. I didn't mean to kill him. I aimed high, thinking to scare him. But the bullet..." He choked on the words. The bullet hit an artery. Outside the confessional, the detectives exchanged glances. Every detail matched Rachel's vision perfectly. "There was a woman," Marcus continued. "She came running to help him. I ran past her as our eyes met. I'll never forget her face, the horror in her eyes, but also the compassion as she tried to stop the bleeding. Rachel Martinez. She tried to save him while I ran away like a coward." Father Anthony's voice was gentle but firm. "Why have you chosen to confess now after all these years?" Marcus lifted his face, tears streaming freely now. "I saw her picture in the paper yesterday. They're going to execute her today. I couldn't let another person die for my sin." He pressed his forehead against the wooden screen. "Every Sunday for 15 years I've lit a candle for Officer Davidson. Every Sunday I've prayed for courage to tell the truth. But I was always too afraid. Afraid of the gang, afraid for my sister's family." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, Rachel's most recent appeal denial. "But last night, something strange happened. I was cleaning the church like always, and suddenly the whole place was filled with this presence. I can't explain it. It was like God himself was in the room, demanding the truth." Father Anthony nodded slowly, remembering Father Miguel's words about the supernatural events unfolding at the prison. "I could feel her," Marcus whispered. "Rachel Martinez. It was like she was here in the church with me, seeing into my soul, and I knew I couldn't hide anymore. God wouldn't let me hide anymore." As if in confirmation of his words, the church's lights flickered, and that same supernatural presence that had filled Rachel's cell seemed to pulse through the confessional. Father Anthony crossed himself, feeling goosebumps rise on his arms. "The gun," Marcus said suddenly. "I buried it in Memorial Park, 20 paces north of the old oak tree near the jogging trail. It's still there, wrapped in plastic, and I kept a diary hidden in my apartment behind a loose brick in the fireplace. Everything is written there, the gang's orders, the threats against Maria, every detail of that night." One of the detectives slipped quietly out of the church, radioing this new information to his colleagues. They already had the gun, exactly where Rachel had said it would be, but the diary would provide crucial corroborating evidence. "There's something else," Marcus added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Officer Davidson. He said something to me before he died. He looked right at me and said, 'I forgive you, son.' Those words have haunted me every day for 15 years. Father Anthony leaned closer to the screen. "God's mercy is greater than any sin, Marcus. But now you must make things right in this world, not just in the confessional." Marcus nodded, squaring his shoulders. "I'm ready, Father. I know the police are waiting outside. I'll tell them everything. I'll testify. Whatever it takes to save Rachel Martinez." As if on cue, the church's heavy doors opened, and Catherine Davidson walked in. She had driven straight from her garden after receiving the call about Rachel's visions. The widow's presence filled the church with a palpable tension as she approached the confessional. Marcus sensed her arrival. Is that his wife?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," Father Anthony confirmed softly. "She's here to hear the truth." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Then, with a courage born of divine intervention, he pushed open the confessional door and stepped out to face her. Their eyes met across the sunlit church, the killer and the widow, brought together by a miracle neither of them fully understood. Catherine Davidson stood very still, studying the man who had killed her husband. The same divine light that had surrounded her in her garden seemed to fill the church now, transforming the space into holy ground. "Mrs. Davidson," Marcus began, falling to his knees before her, "I can never undo what I did. I can never bring him back. But I can tell you the truth. I can save an innocent woman. And I can tell you what Michael said at the end, his words of forgiveness." Catherine moved closer, her steps echoing in the hushed church. The detectives watched in amazement as she knelt beside Marcus, taking his trembling hands in hers. "Tell me everything," she said softly. "Tell me about my husband's last moments. Tell me why Rachel Martinez has spent 15 years in prison for your crime." And so, as the morning sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, Marcus Rodriguez finally told his story in full. Every word was recorded, every detail matched Rachel's miraculous visions, and every moment brought them closer to overturning a 15-year-old wrongful conviction. The true killer had finally confessed, set free by a divine intervention that had begun in a death row cell and was now spreading like holy fire through Houston, touching every life connected to this long-buried tragedy. 1:15 in the afternoon, less than 5 hours before Rachel Martinez's scheduled execution at 6 p.m. The Mountain View unit had become the epicenter of a whirlwind of activity as lawyers, police officers, and prison officials rushed through the corridors. Inside her cell, Rachel remained in a state of supernatural attunement, her body occasionally shimmering with that now familiar divine light. Javier Martinez stood at the center of the administrative office, his law book spread across a conference table as he coordinated with Sarah Chen from the Innocence Project. His laptop displayed multiple windows, Marcus Rodriguez's recorded confession, forensic reports on the newly discovered gun, and a live feed of crews excavating additional evidence from Memorial Park. "We need to file these motions immediately," Laura said, her fingers flying over her keyboard. "The DNA results from Under Officer Davidson's fingernails just came back. They match Marcus Rodriguez. We're building an ironclad case, but we're racing against the clock." Father Miguel burst into the room, his usually calm demeanor charged with urgency. "Catherine Davidson just called from St. Michael's. She's signed an affidavit supporting Rachel's innocence. She's bringing it here personally." Officer Sarah Chen, who had refused to leave her post despite being on duty for over 15 hours, received an urgent radio call. "The governor's office is on the line," she announced. "They're requesting a video conference with Rachel immediately." The atmosphere crackled with the same supernatural energy that had filled Rachel's cell since the early morning hours. As prison officials scrambled to set up the video equipment, Rachel's voice echoed down the corridor, speaking once again in that ancient tongue that had amazed them during her last meal. "It's happening again," Father Miguel said softly, making his way to her cell. The other officials followed, drawn by the otherworldly sound of Rachel's voice. Rachel stood in her cell, that subtle halo of light surrounding her as she spoke in multiple languages, switching seamlessly between them. Suddenly she stopped and turned to face them, her eyes filled with that galaxy-deep awareness they had seen before. "Governor Richards is praying in his office," she said, her voice carrying that resonant quality that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to their souls. The light of God is all around him. He's holding a photo of his daughter from her darkest days of addiction and another from her recovery. God is showing him the parallel, how his daughter found redemption, just as I did. Javier quickly began recording on his phone as his mother continued. The DNA evidence is being processed right now. There's another piece of evidence we didn't know about. Officer Davidson was wearing a body camera that night. The footage was misfiled, forgotten in an evidence locker for 15 years. They're retrieving it now. Sarah Chen immediately grabbed her phone, calling her contacts in the police department to verify this new revelation. Within minutes, she received confirmation. They had indeed just discovered the body camera footage, misfiled under an unrelated case number. "Dear God," Father Miguel whispered, crossing himself. "Every detail, every vision has been proven true." The video conference equipment was wheeled into position outside Rachel's cell. The warden himself approached, his face a mask of professional neutrality despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Mrs. Martinez," he said formally, "Governor Richards wishes to speak with you directly. Are you able to communicate clearly?" Rachel nodded, the supernatural light around her dimming slightly but not disappearing entirely. The screen flickered to life, revealing Governor Richards in his office. The governor's face showed signs of deep emotional turmoil, and those present could see the same strange light that surrounded Rachel was visible in the background of his office. "Mrs. Martinez," the governor began, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been reviewing your case personally all morning. The new evidence, the confession, the DNA results." He paused, visibly struggling. "But there's something else happening here, isn't there? Something beyond our normal understanding of justice and truth." Rachel's response came in that same divinely resonant voice. "God is moving, Governor, not just for my freedom, but for all of us. For you, for Catherine Davidson, for Marcus Rodriguez. This is about redemption on a scale larger than any one person." As if in confirmation of her words, the lights in both the prison and the governor's office flickered simultaneously. Governor Richards leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Mrs. Martinez, I've been a supporter of capital punishment my entire political career. I've signed more death warrants than any governor in Texas history. But today," he swallowed hard, "today, God is showing me something different." Javier stepped closer to the screen, his legal training warring with the miraculous events unfolding before him. "Governor, we've filed an emergency motion for stay of execution. The new evidence alone provides multiple grounds for—" "Young man," the governor interrupted gently, "I'm way ahead of you. I've scheduled a press conference for 3 o'clock, but first," he turned back to Rachel. "Mrs. Martinez, I need to ask you something. These visions you're having, can you tell me about my daughter? About what happened to her 3 years ago that made her finally seek help?" Rachel closed her eyes briefly, that divine light intensifying around her. "She was in a hotel room in Austin," she said softly. "She had hit bottom, was ready to give up, but she saw a light, just like the one in your office now. She heard her late mother's voice telling her to hold on. That help was coming. That's when you found her, Governor. Hugh had felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to drive to Austin that night. You saved her life." Governor Richards slumped in his chair, tears streaming down his face. This was a closely guarded family secret that no one outside his immediate family knew. That's exactly what happened." Before anyone could respond, there was a commotion in the corridor. Catherine Davidson had arrived with her affidavit, but she wasn't alone. Marcus Rodriguez was with her, accompanied by police officers and Father Anthony from St. Michael's. The warden started to object to this irregular gathering, but the supernatural presence in the air seemed to stop his words. Catherine Davidson approached Rachel's cell, her face transformed by the same divine light that filled the space. "I need to see her," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "I need to tell her face to face." The governor was still watching on the video screen as Catherine stepped up to Rachel's cell. The two women faced each other, the widow and the wrongly convicted, both transformed by the miracle unfolding around them. "I'm so sorry," Catherine whispered. "For 15 years, I let my grief blind me to the truth. But God," she gestured to the light that seemed to fill the corridor. "God is showing us all something extraordinary today." Marcus Rodriguez stepped forward, still in handcuffs but his face shining with the peace of confession. "Rachel," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I saw you in my dreams every night for 15 years, you trying to save him while I ran away. I can't take back what I did, but I can tell the truth now. God wouldn't let me hide anymore." Rachel reached through the bars, taking both Catherine's and Marcus's hands in hers. As they touched, the supernatural light flared brilliantly, causing everyone present to step back in awe. Rachel began speaking in tongues again, but this time, everyone in the corridor found they could understand her words, each in their own way. She spoke of forgiveness, of divine justice, of the healing power of truth. She spoke of Governor Richards's daughter, of Catherine's garden prayers, of Marcus's years of hidden penance. Every word seemed to carry the weight of divine authority. Governor Richards watched in amazement through the video feed. "I've seen enough," he said firmly. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to do more than just stay your execution. I'm going to grant you a full pardon. God is doing something profound here in Texas today, and I won't stand in its way." The corridor erupted in tears and prayers of thanksgiving, but Rachel remained serene, that otherworldly light still surrounding her. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "God's not finished. Yet, there's more to come. More healing, more truth, more redemption than any of us can imagine." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the prison windows, the race against time had been won. But as Rachel had said, this was just the beginning. The miracle that had started in a death row cell was about to transform not just one life or one case, but an entire system's understanding of justice, mercy, and the power of divine intervention. 3 o'clock sharp, the television in the Mountain View Unit's administrative office broadcast Governor Richards's press conference live from Austin. Rachel Martinez, still surrounded by that supernatural light, had been moved to a conference room where she sat between Javier and Father Miguel. Catherine Davidson and Marcus Rodriguez, under guard but present by the governor's special permission, watched from nearby chairs. "My fellow Texans," Governor Richards began, his voice carrying an authority tempered by humility, "today we stand witness to something unprecedented in our state's history." The camera panned to show the same divine light that surrounded Rachel was visible in the governor's office, causing a stir among the assembled reporters. 15 years ago, a grave miscarriage of justice occurred in our state. Rachel Martinez was wrongly convicted of the murder of Officer Michael Davidson. Today, through a series of events that can only be described as miraculous, the truth has come to light. The governor held up a stack of documents. "I have here the full confession of the real killer, DNA evidence confirming his guilt, and newly discovered body camera footage that corroborates every detail. But there's something more happening here, something that transcends our normal understanding of justice." As if on cue, Rachel began to speak in tongues again. The reporters at the governor's press conference fell silent as the sound somehow carried through the television, filling both spaces with that other-worldly resonance. Governor Richards paused, visibly moved. "What we're witnessing today isn't just the correction of a wrongful conviction. We're seeing divine intervention in real time. Every person connected to this case has experienced something extraordinary. I myself," he paused, gathering his courage, "I myself have been transformed by what I've witnessed." The governor stepped away from his podium, speaking now from his heart rather than his prepared notes. "For years I've been a staunch supporter of capital punishment. I believed it represented justice at its most definitive. But God has shown me something different today. Through Rachel Martinez's supernatural visions, through the confession they inspired, through the healing taking place even now, I've seen a higher form of justice at work." In the prison conference room, Catherine Davidson reached over to grasp Rachel's hand. The divine light surrounding Rachel seemed to flow between them, healing 15 years of misplaced blame and grief. "Therefore," the governor continued, "I am not only granting Rachel Martinez a full pardon, I am announcing an immediate moratorium on all executions in Texas, pending a complete review of our capital punishment system. The events of today have shown us that there are mysteries of justice and mercy that our human systems cannot fully comprehend." The room erupted in questions, but Governor Richards raised his hand for silence. "Furthermore, I am establishing a special task force to be led by Rachel Martinez upon her release to examine cases of possible wrongful conviction. This task force will work in conjunction with religious leaders, legal experts, and advocates for criminal justice reform." Rachel's voice suddenly filled both rooms again, speaking now in clear English, but with that same divine resonance. "God's justice is not about vengeance, but about restoration, about bringing truth to light and healing to broken places." The supernatural light intensified, and everyone present in both Austin and the prison felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. Governor Richards, on screen, visibly swayed as that divine presence swept through his office. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, addressing her directly through the television, "can you share with us what you're experiencing right now?" Rachel's response came in that same transformed voice. "I see Officer Davidson. He's here with us now." Catherine Davidson gasped, tears streaming down her face. "He wants us to know that this is what he's been praying for all these years in heaven. Not for vengeance, but for healing, for truth, for reconciliation. Marcus Rodriguez fell to his knees, overwhelmed by emotion. I see him too, he whispered. Just like that night. He's smiling. He's at peace. The governor's office and the prison conference room were now filled with the same brilliant, supernatural light. Reporters forgot their questions, guards forgot their protocols, and everyone present found themselves caught up in something far bigger than themselves. Rachel rose to her feet, her voice carrying divine authority. This is the beginning of a new chapter, not just for me or for Texas, but for how we understand justice itself. God is calling us to see beyond our human limitations, to embrace a justice that restores rather than merely punishes. Governor Richards on screen nodded solemnly. Mrs. Martinez, your paperwork is being processed as we speak. You'll be released within the hour, but I suspect your work is just beginning. Yes, Rachel agreed, that celestial light pulsing around her. God has prepared me for 15 years for this moment. Every prayer in my cell, every letter from my son, every conversation with Father Miguel, it was all preparation for what's to come. The governor turned back to the assembled press. I understand that many will question these events. They'll seek scientific explanations for what we've witnessed. But I stand here today, humbled and transformed, to tell you that some things transcend our human understanding. What's happening today in Texas is nothing short of miraculous. In the prison conference room, Javier wrapped his arms around his mother, feeling that divine energy flow through him. Mom, he whispered, we did it. You're going home. But Rachel's attention had shifted again, her eyes focused on something others couldn't see. There's more, she said softly. So many more innocent people praying in cells across this country. This is just the beginning of God's work of restoration. Catherine Davidson stood, her face radiant with the same supernatural light. I want to be part of this, she declared. Michael would want me to be part of this. His death has become a catalyst for something beautiful. Marcus Rodriguez, still on his knees, looked up at Rachel with tears streaming down his face. Even me? Can God use even me in this work of restoration? Rachel reached down to help him up, that divine light enveloping them both. Especially you, Marcus. Your confession, inspired by God's presence, is what broke open the gates of truth. Your testimony will help others find the courage to confess, to choose truth over fear. Father Miguel, who had witnessed every step of Rachel's journey, began to pray softly in Latin. The words seemed to carry that same supernatural resonance, mixing with Rachel's prophetic utterances to create a harmony that filled the room with holy power. The governor's press conference continued, but in the prison conference room, something even more profound was taking place. A group of people who had been divided by tragedy were being united by miracle. The divine light that had started in Rachel's cell had grown to encompass them all, breaking down walls of hatred, fear, and prejudice. As the afternoon sun began to set, the same sun that was supposed to witness Rachel's execution, it instead illuminated the beginning of something extraordinary. Rachel Martinez, once condemned to death, had become an instrument of divine justice, a vessel for a miracle that would ripple out from Texas to transform lives across the nation. The miracle wasn't just her salvation from death row, it was the supernatural breaking into the natural, the divine interrupting human justice with a higher purpose. It was restoration replacing retribution, healing overcoming hatred, and truth triumphant over darkness. 5 o'clock in the evening, exactly 1 hour before Rachel Martinez had been scheduled to die, she walked through the gates of Mountain View Unit as a free woman. The setting Texas sun bathed everything in golden light, mixing with the supernatural radiance that still surrounded her. Javier stood at her side, supporting her as she took her first steps of freedom in 15 years. Father Miguel followed close behind, carrying Rachel's few possessions in a small box, her Bible, Javier's letters, and the worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit they had read together during her last night on death row. Catherine Davidson and Officer Sarah Chen walked with them, both transformed by the miraculous events they had witnessed. As they reached the prison parking lot, Rachel stopped, overwhelmed by the openness of the sky above her. The divine presence that had filled her cell now seemed to expand outward, touching everything around them with that same celestial light. "Mom?" Javier asked softly, feeling her tremble beside him. "Are you okay?" Rachel turned to face the prison walls one last time. "I'm seeing it all differently now," she said, her voice still carrying that supernatural resonance. Every cell, every prayer, every moment of despair and hope God was using it all to prepare for this day. Catherine Davidson stepped forward, taking Rachel's other arm. The two women had formed an extraordinary bond in the hours since the miracle began. "Michael would be proud of what's happening here," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "This is the kind of justice he always believed in, even if I couldn't see it before." Inside the prison, Marcus Rodriguez was being processed for transfer, but his written confession had become a powerful testimony. Already, 3 other inmates in different facilities had come forward with similar confessions, inspired by the news of what God had done through Rachel's supernatural intervention. "The light is spreading," Rachel said suddenly, her eyes taking on that galaxy-deep awareness they had come to recognize. "I can see it moving through prisons across Texas, across the country. This is bigger than any of us imagined." Father Miguel nodded, pulling out his phone to show her the news headlines already spreading across the nation. "Miracle on death row, divine intervention, saves innocent woman. Texas governor declares moratorium on executions after supernatural events. Death row inmates' visions lead to real killer's confession." "Mrs. Martinez," a voice called out. They turned to see Sarah Chen from the Innocence Project hurrying toward them, waving a document. "The governor just signed the executive order establishing your task force. They want you to start as soon as you're ready." Rachel smiled, that divine light pulsing around her. "God's already showing me where to begin. There are others, so many others, who need their truth to be heard." As they walked toward the waiting cars, Rachel suddenly stopped again, her body tensed, and that now familiar supernatural energy crackled through the air. She began speaking in tongues, but this time the words seemed to paint images in the air around them, visions of other prisoners, other cases, other miracles waiting to happen. "I see them," she said, switching back to English. 7 cases in Texas alone. Innocent people who have nearly lost hope. God is going to use what happened here to set them free too. Officer Chen, who had followed them out despite the end of her shift, pulled out her notebook. She had become an unofficial chronicler of the miraculous events, documenting every supernatural manifestation with methodical precision. "Do you see their names?" she asked. Rachel nodded, that celestial resonance filling her voice. "James Wilson in Huntsville, Maria Suarez in Gatesville, Anthony Brooks." She listed 5 more names, providing details about their cases that would later be proven eerily accurate. As she spoke, Javier used his phone to record everything, his legal training combining with his faith in his mother's visions. They had learned that every detail she shared under divine inspiration had significance. A small crowd had gathered at the prison gates, reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers, drawn by the news of the supernatural events. As Rachel approached them, that divine light seemed to touch each person present, creating a moment of holy awe that silenced even the most skeptical journalists. "Mrs. Martinez," one reporter managed to ask, "what does freedom feel like after 15 years? Rachel's response carried the weight of prophetic authority. "This isn't just about my freedom. God is doing something new in our justice system. He's showing us that true justice comes through restoration, not retribution, through truth, not vengeance." Catherine Davidson, still holding Rachel's arm, addressed the crowd. "I stand here as proof that healing is possible. For 15 years, I wanted vengeance for my husband's death, but God showed us all a better way. Michael's legacy will now be one of transformation, not tragedy." Father Miguel stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion. "I have been a priest for 30 years, and I have never seen anything like what God has done here. This is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of a movement." As if to confirm his words, Rachel began to glow more intensely with that supernatural light. The crowd gasped as she began to speak in multiple languages again, each person somehow understanding in their own tongue. She spoke of hope, of restoration, of a new kind of justice that would transform lives across the nation. Javier watched his mother in amazement, remembering the broken woman he had visited in prison for 15 years. She had entered those walls as a recovering addict, wrongly convicted of murder. She was emerging as a prophet, a leader, a vessel for divine justice. "Look," Officer Chen whispered, pointing to the prison walls. The supernatural light that surrounded Rachel had begun to spread, touching the building itself with that celestial radiance. Those watching could have sworn they heard the sound of chains breaking, of doors opening, not physical ones, but spiritual barriers crumbling under the weight of divine intervention. Rachel turned to address the crowd one final time. "Today marks the beginning of something extraordinary. God has shown us that no system of justice is beyond His power to transform. No truth is beyond his ability to reveal. No wound is beyond his power to heal. As they finally moved toward the waiting cars, Rachel paused one last time. The divine light around her pulsed with renewed intensity as she spoke. For 15 years, I prayed in my cell, not just for my freedom, but for God to use my situation for His glory. Today we've seen just the beginning of His answer to those prayers. The sun had nearly set now, painting the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to merge with the supernatural radiance surrounding them. As Rachel Martinez left Mountain View Unit behind, she carried with her not just her freedom, but a divine mandate to transform the very nature of justice in America. The miracle that had begun in a death row cell was now spreading outward, touching lives and institutions with the power of divine truth. Rachel's liberation was more than just a personal victory. It was the beginning of a movement that would bring hope to the hopeless and light to the darkest corners of the justice system. 1 year after Rachel Martinez walked out of Mountain View Unit, surrounded by divine light, the Texas justice system had undergone a transformation that few could have imagined. The small office suite in downtown Houston that housed the Divine Justice Initiative hummed with activity as Rachel prepared for another day of miracle-inspired work. The walls of her office told the story of the past year through newspaper headlines and photographs. 7 more innocent prisoners released after Martinez's visions proven true. Texas legislature passes landmark criminal justice reform bill. Former death row inmate leads national movement for restorative justice. Each headline marked another victory in what had become known as the Texas Miracle. Rachel sat at her desk, that supernatural light still visible around her, though now it was a gentle glow rather than the intense radiance of that first miraculous day. She was reviewing case files when Catherine Davidson entered, carrying fresh coffee and a stack of letters from inmates seeking help. "Good morning," Catherine said warmly. After her husband's murder, no one could have imagined she would become Rachel's closest friend and partner in the ministry. "Marcus's parole hearing is this afternoon. The governor himself will be attending." Rachel nodded, that familiar divine awareness filling her eyes. "He's ready. His testimony has already helped free 3 other innocent people, and God's not finished with him yet." Marcus Rodriguez had served 1 year of a negotiated 15-year sentence for Officer Davidson's murder, but his genuine remorse and active participation in revealing truth in other cases had made him eligible for early parole. His confession had inspired a movement of truth and restoration among inmates across the country. Javier arrived next, now a full-time attorney for the initiative, carrying his ever-present legal pad. "Mum, you won't believe this. Remember James Wilson's case that you saw in your vision outside the prison? The DNA results just came back. Everything you said about the real killer was exactly right." Rachel smiled softly. The supernatural revelations hadn't stopped with her release. They had evolved into a steady stream of divine guidance that had helped free 23 innocent prisoners in the past year alone. Each case had been accompanied by miraculous confirmations that left even skeptics struggling to explain the results. Father Miguel entered the office, followed by Officer Sarah Chen, who had left her prison job to work full-time with the initiative. The priest's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Rachel, the Vatican is sending representatives to study what they're calling the Houston phenomenon. They're particularly interested in the gift of tongues that still manifests during your prison ministry." Indeed, Rachel's weekly services in prisons across Texas had become powerful demonstrations of supernatural intervention. Inmates would hear her words in their native languages, and the same divine light that had filled her death row cell would transform prison chapels into spaces of miraculous healing and revelation. "The governor's office called," Sarah added, checking her phone. "The task force results are in. Death row populations have decreased by 40% across the state as cases are being reviewed under the new divine justice protocols you helped establish." Rachel stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Houston skyline. The city had become ground zero for a revolution in criminal justice, one guided by a combination of supernatural discernment and rigorous legal process. The model was being studied and implemented by states across the nation. "We're just getting started," Rachel said, her voice carrying that familiar resonant quality. "God is showing me more cases, more lives to be transformed. This was never just about proving innocence. It's about demonstrating a different kind of justice." The room fell quiet as Rachel began to speak in tongues, that celestial light intensifying around her. Images appeared in the air, faces of prisoners, locations of hidden evidence, details of cases yet to be revealed. Javier recorded everything, knowing from experience that each detail would prove crucial in the weeks to come. Catherine moved to stand beside her friend, remembering how far they'd come from that miraculous day a year ago. "Michael would be so proud of what's happening here," she said softly. "His death has brought forth so much life." Rachel turned to her team, her eyes filled with that galaxy-deep awareness they had come to recognize. "God is showing me the next phase. It's bigger than individual cases now. He's calling us to transform the entire system of justice in this nation." She began to share the vision. A network of divine justice centers across the country, each combining supernatural discernment with legal expertise. Training programs for lawyers and judges to understand restorative justice principles. A complete overhaul of how society approaches crime, punishment, and redemption. As she spoke, that divine light seemed to fill the office, touching each person present with its transformative power. Father Miguel began to pray in Latin, his words harmonizing with Rachel's prophetic utterances in a way that had become familiar during their ministry sessions. "The governor's press conference is in an hour," Javier reminded them, though he was as caught up in the moment as everyone else. "They're announcing the expansion of the initiative to 5 more states." Rachel nodded, the supernatural light settling back into its gentle glow. "Before we go, there's something else God is showing me." She picked up a particular case file from her desk, one they hadn't planned to review that day. "This one. God says this is next." The team gathered around as she opened the file, knowing from experience that every case Rachel identified under divine guidance held special significance. This one involved a death row inmate in California, convicted 15 years ago under circumstances eerily similar to Rachel's own case. "Pack your bags," she said, that prophetic resonance filling her voice. "God is taking this ministry national." What happened here in Texas was just the preparation for something much larger. As they prepared to leave for the governor's press conference, Rachel paused to look at the photo wall they'd created. Images of freed prisoners, restored families, transformed lives. Among them was a picture from exactly 1 year ago, Rachel walking out of Mountain View Unit, surrounded by divine light, stepping into a calling none of them could have imagined. "We've seen 23 miracles of justice this year," she said softly, "but God is showing me hundreds more to come. This is His justice revolution, and it's only beginning." The team gathered their materials and headed out, each person aware that they were part of something that transcended human understanding. Rachel Martinez, once condemned to death, had become a vessel for divine justice, leading a movement that was reshaping the American legal system. As they left the office, that supernatural light seemed to trail behind them, touching everyone they passed with its gentle radiance. The transformation that had begun in a death row cell had become a beacon of hope for thousands, a living testimony to the power of divine intervention in human justice. The Texas miracle, as the media called it, was no longer just a Texas phenomenon. It was spreading across the nation, carrying with it the promise of a new kind of justice, one that balanced truth with mercy, judgment with restoration, and human law with divine wisdom. Rachel Martinez had emerged from death row not just as a freed prisoner, but as a prophet of transformation, carrying a message that would continue to change lives and systems for generations to come. Her story had become a testament to the power of faith, the reality of miracles, and the boundless possibilities when divine justice breaks into the human realm. If you've been touched by Rachel Martinez's extraordinary journey from death row to divine purpose, share your thoughts below. What moment in this story of supernatural justice and redemption moved you the most? Was it the miraculous vision that revealed the truth, the touching reunion with her son Javier, or perhaps the powerful reconciliation with Officer Davidson's widow? Your perspective on this tale of faith, forgiveness, and divine intervention matters. Let us know in the comments how this story of transformation has impacted you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where divine justice transformed a seemingly hopeless situation?